Hi, thanks for watching this video. The purpose of this video is to watch some of the idents that we had in the development process, give some insights on how we made them, and really explain what we were trying to show with each one and why they ended up being reworked. The first ident that we'll be taking a look at is the chair match cut. As you just saw, there was a lot happening in that ident. This version was especially inspired by films like Everything Everywhere All at Once or Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. The idea here was to connote the variety and diversity of experiences that can be had through IMAX's offerings, whether that be films, live events, or documentaries. It's obviously quite a surrealist take on what going to the cinema feels like, which is also quite meta-modern. There was a time where the scenarios were all going to be callbacks to iconic moments in films, for example, the T-Rex roar in Jurassic Park. This idea was kind of scrapped in favour of exploring these new avenues of these really absurd situations that the audience member might find themselves in when they're completely immersed. The main purpose of making that version of the ident was to figure out the tempo and where we were going to include areas of kind of comedic moments between these really intense visuals. One of those comedic moments that we were quite fond of was taking the viewer and putting them in the tennis audience. Here, the shot would omit any action, which would then just show this tennis audience looking side to side, and we'd hold on this for a couple of seconds and just break out the sound design. This idea would eventually be scrapped and replaced with an ident that had the intention of communicating a bit more with the audience. So the next ident that we'll watch is the first demo of the rework. This is specifically my cut. And Tom and Harrison also had their cuts, but mine was the only one that was realised as a video. This version of the ident has been thrown together really quickly using clips from different films or shows that provide visual inspiration. You'll notice that this one also has some music in the background. This is Ludwig Göransson's Can You Hear the Music from Oppenheimer, which is a very awe-inspiring and uplifting track. So the first thing that'll stick out is that the theme of this ident is very different. It's a lot more dramatic and cinematic. At this stage, we hadn't made a concrete decision on whether we were going to have on-screen text, narration, or just let the video footage play out. The key advantage to using on-screen text as opposed to narration would be that it's easier to replace for a global audience. You just have to translate the text. This ident jumps from each experience one by one, starting with realities, switching to live, going to beyond, and then finishing on 70mm. Which was, in my head, the most grand ident. The idea here was to build up this anticipation that you normally want to have before you watch an IMAX experience. Currently, they have a countdown, and this would probably replace that and really get the energy going in the theatre. So going through it section by section, the opening would be a very meta kind of reflection on the cinema. The audience members looking at people sitting in the cinemas. Here, the sound design would be quite realistic. This would immediately go out the window when we dive into the reality segment of the ident. Now, knowing the time constraints, budget constraints, and also the technical limitations of us three as a team, this part of the ident would just show a person and rely heavily on the kind of the acting and the sound design. So the audience member that we're following in the ident would have this really visceral reaction to seeing something that's quite beautiful but also quite intimidating. This would be a really good opportunity to flex the IMAX soundscape as well, and build this kind of 3D environment, which was an avenue that we were quite interested in exploring. The next shot on the ident is this really crazy zoom out shot from the theatre to reveal a globe, which would then transition to this eyeball. This was quite an ambitious inclusion, and we had the idea of kind of throwing this together by using Google Maps images and just really playing into the speed and the effects. After we land on the globe, this would be a 3D render that Harrison had already covered good ground in Blender. And then we have this shot from the globe to the eyeball, which would need a transition. We had some discussions about what this could be, and some of the ideas included a match cut, some cross dissolve, or maybe even a morph cut. We were trying to incorporate a lot of filmmaking techniques so that the ident wouldn't feel too disjointed from the experiences that you'd expect in a cinema. This would then be interrupted by the audience member getting hit with some liquid, which would then take them to any manner of live events. So this could be a drink from a football match, or in a concert somebody spills something. And here we intended to incorporate this whip pan, which was inspired by the work of Damien Chazelle, where he uses these to jump between shots in a more interesting and energetic way. And that really is the heart of the live section of this ident. It's the energy and the youthfulness behind it. We were really trying to hone into the atmosphere there. And we whip pan out of that into arguably the most ambitious part of the ident. This is for Beyond, formerly known as IMAX Enhanced, which is this enhanced streaming service. So the idea behind this section was to show the immersion of watching TV at home by the TV expanding. This would be through a lot of particles flying out of the screen and kind of filling the area with this new lighting. We did have a really good plan on how we were going to tackle this scene, which was by using LiDAR to scan an environment and take that into a 3D area. And then we were going to project this white screen onto the TV, and then Harrison would then animate some particles in this 3D environment. And the camera work would all be handled digitally. And speaking of the camera work, the idea here was to pan all the way up, which would then eventually reveal the viewer from the other side. This is where we hit a kind of an issue, which was that if the camera did a full 180 by going all the way up and revealing what's behind the camera, that would surely show the viewer looking straight into the camera. But for the next shot to really work, it would have to show the back of the viewer's head. So this kind of became an impossible shot that we were going to kind of solve with some sleight of hand. And then here, playing into the idea of the 70mm logo, we were going to show this viewer looking at this huge screen that's just filling the entire room with light. And this is meant to be a reflection of the 70mm projection, which I've been to one of them, and it's pretty insane what the technology can do. This shot would slowly zoom out just to reveal the sheer scale of the image, and this would also be within a 3D environment. Now, we hadn't fully decided what was going to be on screen, but we were thinking of some very luminescent space visuals. We'd then get to see this very human element after seeing these quite 3D visuals. And the idea here was just really explore the kind of emotional side and the connection that's built between the viewer and the content. So these would be extreme close-ups, just highlighting different emotions. And in terms of music, this is where everything would crescendo and then dip to black, which is where the experience would actually start. Now, we were pretty keen on getting this ident made, but we were approaching the deadline pretty swiftly. I think we were about 2 weeks away from it at this point. And the feedback that we got was that we really just need to get out and film something, which is where the next demonstration comes in. So this is the same ident, just recreated using some material that we actually filmed. You'll notice that the music is also different. This is a track called Run With Me by Philip Shepard for the game Detroit Become Human. The reason I switched the track over to this one was because it felt slightly more introspective and a bit more curious. So looking at the final draft ident that we made, there's a good variety of footage that we sourced and filmed. The first thing that might stick out is this really creepy AI image that we had to use because I felt that we hadn't gotten the right shot for the opening. And then we swiftly transitioned to the reality segment, which we actually managed to film using these light bars that I have, which are programmable. And we filmed this by just hovering these light bars around Tom's face as he put on some very convincing acting. Now, I did pick up on one issue here in post-production, which was the fact that we need to balance the soundscape that we wanted to design with the music, which couldn't just start halfway through. It really had to start at this point. So trying to figure out how we were going to do that was definitely going to be a challenge. And then, as you can see, we retained that crazy shot, which would zoom out from the theatre to space. And instead of showing the entire globe, here we just show the horizon. This would then be a slow dissolve into this really close-up shot of the eye, which is meant to be a slightly more abstract. The reason we did this was to really create the differentiation between realities and live. We didn't want to have the transition be too smooth because that might confuse the viewer into thinking that they're part of the same experience. In this shot of the eye, we also attempted to get some dilation of the pupil, which we thought looks pretty interesting. This would be a continuous zoom out, which would then cut halfway through to a further zoomed out shot, which would reveal the audience member as part of this live experience. And here you get to see these really silly videos of us creating placeholders. Now we intended to shoot these by getting as many people as we could together and building up a crowd and recreating this environment because we wanted to refrain from using stock footage. And here you have the Beyond section, which is largely unchanged, though this version omits the idea of cutting to the audience member looking at a 70mm screen in favour of creating that differentiation I spoke about earlier. And here's when the music would really start to build up and become quite epic. And we'd start to intercut between this zoom out shot that we had in the previous version of the ident and these more abstract shots of the cinema. The inspiration for this shot came as I went to one of the cinemas around the time of editing this version of the ident. And as I was trying to just absorb the atmosphere of the cinema, one thing I noticed, and that really stuck out to me, was this kind of image of the projector catching all the dust in the air as it was showing the end credits, which I thought was quite an interesting and beautiful visual. So I decided to capture that and try and lean into that with the rest of the ident by cutting between this grand shot and also this very close personal macro shot of the screening process. This would be inspired by some videos that Harrison had brought up titled "We Recreated the Nuclear Explosion from Oppenheimer with Zero CGI." And we were quite inspired by this video to maybe have a crack at creating some visual effects of our own, which would then be intercut. This would also help with some of the pacing issues and would also give a good opportunity for us to really get the tempo of the scene right with the music. And the placeholder shot of Tom looking at the 70mm screen has a quite funny story behind it. We filmed this by going into one of the lecture halls and projecting this really cool video that we found online. And we put Tom in this chair with wheels on it. And for this specific take, what happened was Harrison was filming it by sitting further back in the stairs. And whilst he was filming it, he was zooming out using the optical zoom. And all whilst doing that, I was pushing Tom forwards on the floor by just laying down, which then started to create this illusion of this depth and scale. And the final shot of the ident would be this kind of connection between these two viewers, which would then lead to this very dramatic cut to black. And then there'd be a voiceover which would just ask the question, "What did you think?" This is something that we took from our personal experiences going to the cinemas, and that's normally the first thing that you'd say to somebody as you're leaving the theatre. And the idea here was to really hammer home the kind of point of the connection and the shared experience of the cinema, which in a way for this ident was the connective tissue between all the different experiences. Ultimately, this version of the ident would be scrapped, mainly because it just didn't really answer the brief in the way that we understood it. Thanks for watching.